But today we're talking about democracy's unlikely origins, King John, and Magna Carta. And so I think that this, hopefully anyway, is going to be an interesting topic. I certainly had a lot of fun as I was looking up all kinds of different things about monarchy and found lots of information. And so this is going to be a little wide-ranging, but a lot of this is all new material. We've never presented on any of this before. So Winston Churchill, when he kind of made his assessment, he's a historian, but he's also quite a partisan historian. And we'll actually find that in the course of understanding both King John and Magna Carta, all history is remembered through lenses. Those lenses were often very partisan. And in some sense, people always say things like, well, they hate revisionist history. But in fact, all history is revisionist. The simple fact of doing history or writing history is itself a revision, even reading just history, just trying to read a document for the first time, even if it's a primary document, for in your own time and place using the words or translation as you understand it. The fact that that survived, the fact that you're reading it is already going to be a revision of history because it's going through your own mental frame. However, Magna Carta and King John have actually been subjected to lots of oscillating, very partisan revisionist history throughout the last 4 or 5 centuries. So what does Churchill say? So he says, when the long tally is added, it will be seen that the British nation and the English-speaking world owe far more to the vices of King John than to the labors of virtuous sovereigns. So looking back on it, he's remembering King John was not remembered as a great king. His life is full of vice, as people remember. And yet, if you add up the tally and do the calculus, all of the virtuous kings and queens and all of their labors are not going to add up to the same thing, presumably as Magna Carta, is more or less what he's saying on the scales. So calculus here then, if we take, let's say, someone who's remembered as a very good king and always gets cast by actors who want to play, King Henry V. So he's generally remembered as a really good king, right? And he was successful at the time of conquering France in the year 1420, which is something that everyone loves to do. If you can do it, it's the Germans loved it, the English, even Julius Caesar loved to conquer France. The Franks loved to conquer it. But what did Britain today, what do they get for that? So what did Henry V leave us as a legacy for having conquered France temporarily, except for Britain's semi-defunct bragging rights? There's been a lot of back and forth. So by contrast, King John, who's generally remembered as quite a terrible king, issued Magna Carta in 1215. And so Churchill's calculus is since that's remembered as foundational to constitutional democracy, obviously in the scales, that's a lot more important. So what do I want to look at? I want to look a little bit about what is Magna Carta. I want to look, kind of briefly about what its contents actually are, but what were the purpose of those contents at the time it was written. Some of the subsequent effects that Magna Carta have had, and frankly, and also kind of more importantly, maybe even, or not just as importantly, how has it achieved its present reputation as a foundational document of Western democracy? In addition, I want to look at King John and kind of ask who this guy was. Why did he issue the document that's remembered as Magna Carta? And maybe was he a terrible king? And if not, why is he generally remembered that way? And so this is just, again, a recent portrayal of King John. And then I also want to look at some of these ideas of constitution and monarchy and how we got from there to here, and kind of where we're at, and somewhat, in some sense, this is a strange picture, and it's certainly not. Anyway, it'd be somewhat alien to Republican places like the United States, where obviously they've had a different tradition. So who's this kid? Anybody know? Naruhito. Hisahito, I think is his name, maybe. Prince Hisahito of Akishino. And so he's born 12 years ago on September 2006. So he is second in line to become Emperor of Japan. He's one of the heirs then to the chrysanthemum throne. He is the he's the son of Prince Fumihito, who is the first in line after the emperor. So the newly enthroned Emperor Naruhito, and his two heirs essentially are his younger brother and that younger brother's only son. So born in 2006, Hisahito is the first male heir born to the Japanese imperial house since 1965, which that's kind of hanging by a thread if you can think about how 1,500 year or more old line. Essentially 1965, in other words, his father, right? So there have been no male heirs since his father was born, and so you can imagine how excited everybody was about this kid. So the new emperor, you might have been seen that the previous emperor has retired and become emeritus emperor for the first time in many centuries. And his son now is emperor as of May 1st, 2019. He is married to the Empress Masako here, and they have one child, Princess Aiko. So they have a daughter. But the current constitution in Japan is male-only succession. So although even though in the past, actually a fair number of women have ruled as emperor, so there have been female monarchs of Japan historically, the current constitution, which the U.S. helped impose and helped create and shape after World War II, forbids the accession of women or the succession through the female line, and thus Princess Aiko is disinherited, as are all the other women of the imperial house. And indeed, actually, one of the things that had always existed up until that time is that there were all sorts of collateral houses that were more or less part of the imperial family more broadly. They also were all disinherited, and it's only the descendants of Hirohito, so the male descendants, and that's the entire potential for the succession. Why did they do that? So here's U.S. General MacArthur, who was in charge of the occupation of Japan, and Emperor Hirohito together. So although Hirohito had been the head of state throughout World War II, and the monarchy wasn't entirely just a constitutional or figurehead monarchy, so he had some power and some say, and so even though therefore he is the leader of, or especially the head of state then, of what the U.S.'s enemy power in the conflict, nevertheless, the calculus changed pretty quickly at the end of World War II as the United States was looking at not as much as the defeated enemies, the Germany and Japan, as enemies anymore, but was instead starting to see the Soviet Union and other places as a threat. They were also concerned with their other allies' ongoing attempts at imperialism. The U.S. was against that at the time. So the U.S. wanted then, as they rebuilt or reconstructed Japan, they actually, MacArthur wanted Hirohito to remain in power and not abdicate, as many of the people in his actually own house wanted, in order to have him take the blame for the failure and the defeat, and then maybe his son then would start fresh at that point. So the goal of the United States in limiting the succession in the Japanese imperial house was there was a concern that if there was a militarist faction like the faction that had more or less ruled Japan as an empire in the time leading up to and through the World War, if that were to regain power, they might be able to get one of these collateral princes and say he's the real emperor, and essentially have a little civil war and have a coup and take that over. So delegitimizing all of those guys was a way of delegitimizing any potential rival factions to the U.S. reconstructed government. Okay, so that's a lot of history writing on one boy, right? So the world's oldest extant hereditary monarchy is what this is usually listed as. So the power of the emperors has waxed and waned. So at some points under the shogunate, the imperial house was more or less figurehead. But as of the Meiji Restoration, there was more power again in the house. Sometimes the imperial house has held actually a lot of power or direct rule. It goes all the way back then from legendary origins in 660 BC to origins that can actually be historically verified in the 6th century AD, which makes it, anyway, what's, quote, world's oldest extant continuous hereditary monarchy. So and some of the European houses have ancestry that traces back to that, and kings that trace back to that. But for example, the British monarchy, there's a whole bunch of mess that happens in the 11th century as the Danes are conquering England and Canute and stuff like that. So in other words, the house hasn't always been continuously ruling, right? Okay, so how big a claim is that? How many monarchs are left, to be the oldest, but the oldest one standing, right? So prior to World War I, monarchies really were the norm. There was, for one thing, empires and emperors, lots of them. So there was the British, German, Ottoman, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, Persian, Ethiopian, and other empires. The Japanese monarch now is the only remaining emperor. So there's no ruling house that claims the title emperor. And then there were just unending numbers of kingdoms and other monarchies that existed prior to World War I. It was really the norm. However, after World War I, monarchies largely fell by the wayside. So famously here, the Romanov family, the Tsars of Russia, the whole family was executed by the Soviets in 1918 in the wake of World War I and the Soviet Revolution. So today, there's actually fewer than you'd think, or fewer than I was thinking, because I guess moving to Canada, I was thinking, well, there must be a lot of constitutional monarchies and things like that. But essentially, as we're writing out here, light gray is not monarchy. Darker gray is kind of republics that actually have active monarchists in them. So this is presumably this map I think is made by kind of a hopeful monarchist who was thinking, well, maybe the Russians will bring the Tsar back, or maybe the Persians will bring the Shah back. Anyway, but most places don't have even those kind of sympathies. And so largely this is the Commonwealth realms, so the United Kingdom and then all of the other 15 other countries that have Queen Elizabeth as their monarch, other constitutional monarchies, semi-constitutional monarchies, so which is to say it's a monarchy that has a constitution, but the monarch has a lot more than just the kind of symbolic power that you think of Queen Elizabeth as exercising. And then absolute monarchies where the monarch has total control over the state. And then we also have on here subnational monarchies, which is to say, if you are the traditional leader or king or monarch of, let's say, a nation that doesn't own a country. So if you're the Xhosa nation in South Africa, they have a royal family and there may be a king. So India used to have a bazillion of these when under the British Raj, right? So there were all these little monarchs that were in charge of different realms within India, but they wouldn't have been, their foreign policy would be handled by the British, that kind of thing. So subnational.
What's with South Africa?
Subnational monarchy. So that means there are kings like the Zulus or the Xhosa. There are local monarchs of peoples that are not in charge of the entire kingdom or whatever. It's not like, like the king of Spain is king of all the Spanish people, right? Whereas the king of the Xhosa is only the head of that particular nation within the Union of South Africa. And so I guess I was just reading, I didn't know this, that Nelson Mandela is actually from the Xhosa royal family. But anyway, I didn't know that. Okay, 16 Commonwealth realms. So everybody gets to share the British monarch, right? And most of these are pretty tiny, but there's a couple bigger ones. So Antigua and Barbuda, Australia, the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Canada, here we are, Grenada, Jamaica, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So we're all sharing her. There are other European countries then that have constitutional monarchies. So Andorra and Spain, then the three Low Countries, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, and 3 of the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Just to bring this out because it's an interesting one. So if you've ever, I don't know if you've ever been to Andorra. It's a beautiful little place, but it's nestled between Spain in the Pyrenees, between Spain and France. It's a very tiny little country. It is primarily has its existence now as a very large duty-free shop, and so you go there to get all the kind of giant barrels of cheese that you'd ever want without duty. Anyway, so it's a diarchy because its princes, so the kings or the monarchs, 2 monarchs of Andorra, are in fact the Bishop of Urgell, which is a city in Catalonia in Spain, and the president of France. And so the people of Andorra are kind of unique in that they have 2 monarchs and they don't elect either one of them. And in fact, the people of France elect their one monarch, and presumably whatever the archbishop who's in charge of Urgell picks, or the pope picks whoever the bishop of Urgell is. So it's a different kind of little place. There are a bunch of other constitutional monarchies across the world, so Bhutan, Cambodia, Japan we were talking about, Thailand, Malaysia, Jordan, Morocco, Lesotho, Tonga. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I made these slides all today very fast. So there's typos, sorry. Okay, so among these, Bhutan is kind of interesting because Bhutan actually quite recently transitioned from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy in 2005 when its king, Yingmei Singye Wangchuck, he just transferred most of his powers, or almost all of his powers, to a national assembly, and then after doing that he abdicated in favor of his son, who was left without, who's now a constitutional monarch, as opposed to, probably didn't trust his son to do it, but he just did it himself, and there it is. So then, okay, these mixed ones, right? So these ones that have constitutions, but nevertheless the monarch has a lot more power than what we're used to as a symbolic head of state. So Monaco, Liechtenstein, Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates. And so as an example, Liechtenstein, which is right there in the Alps between Switzerland and Austria. The Prince of Liechtenstein, the monarch, who is also the richest monarch in all of Europe, so a very wealthy guy, has the right to veto any law that the Liechtenstein parliament, the Landtag, makes, and so he has the right of veto. And he also can fire any official in the government, whether they're an elected official or an appointed official. So it's actually quite a very serious amount of power for what you think of as a European monarchy and that kind of thing to this day. There is, though it is not absolute, that seems kind of absolute, it's apparently not absolute because the Constitution allows then for a referendum of the people of Liechtenstein to overturn the prince. And so essentially, which I think is kind of like the kind of monarchical nuclear option. And so the guy needs to at least, not fire everybody and not overturn all the laws, if that means that, a referendum is, could wipe him out, right? He'd still be pretty rich. So then, I'm sorry.
Has he used his veto lately?
So I don't know the details. The question is, has he used his veto? And I don't know. I think this is a new constitution as of 2005, and I haven't seen the details of how it's operating. But I just found it to be very interesting.
We all might have heard if he had.
Well, I don't know. The question is, we might have heard if he had used his veto, and I think we probably wouldn't, because we don't hear too much news out of Liechtenstein. So unless it was very serious, if he was doing something that everybody was really mad at and everybody in Liechtenstein was mad, we'd hear about it.
And try to unveto.
If there was going to be a referendum, I'm sure we'd hear about it, especially if you have a subscription to The Economist. Okay, and so then the absolute monarchies. So Brunei, who's been in the news for doing absolutely awful things. Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. We've seen that, quite a large country with lots and lots of money whose new monarch can kind of do more or less whatever he wants. Eswatini, which you probably never maybe even heard of Eswatini, but the absolute monarch of what had been Swaziland decreed that now the country will be called Eswatini. And so that's why it is called something new, because he's a monarch and he can do that. That's also potentially a diarchy, because his mother, I think, is able to exercise a constitutional veto power over him, which is a weird twist that I'm sure lots of kings don't envy.
Where is the Queen Mother's Hill?
So the question is, where is Swaziland? And it's down South Africa.
Really somewhere in the middle of South Africa.
It's right around, in the middle of, I don't think it's not, Lesotho's the one that's totally engulfed in South Africa, but it's the other one, right? They both are?
Yeah.
Okay. So they're landlocked, and South Africa's right around them. So then Vatican City, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. You maybe haven't heard of them. And maybe North Korea. I'll make my case. We'll see. So Vatican City. Okay. So I would argue that the monarchy here is actually even older than Japan's, but it doesn't count in that thing of continuous hereditary monarchy, because it's not a hereditary monarchy. It's an elective monarchy. And so the line of the bishops of Rome extends nearly, not quite 2,000 years. Legendarily, it goes almost 2,000 years. And the popes have exercised varying degrees of temporal sovereignty in the city since the 5th century. And so therefore, a monarchy that has had essentially temporal teeth more or less since, although it's now, the amount of territory they have is reduced to a very tiny amount in the number of people temporally. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta, by the way, got kicked out of Malta. And so they are the one largely or widely recognized sovereign entity that doesn't actually possess a state at this point. So founded 1099 as the Knights of St. John, and the Hospitallers, if you've heard of, it's like the Templars and then the Hospitallers. We were a crusading order. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta has been without a state since Napoleon kicked the Knights off of the island in 1798. So on his way to conquer Egypt, Napoleon stopped by Malta and kicked out the Maltese Knights. Nevertheless, they've continued. They already were quite wealthy. They had a bunch of different property all around, not just in Malta. And so they've been able to maintain their claim to sovereignty, and they have diplomatic relations with 107 states. And they have permanent observer status at the United Nations. So essentially, if sovereignty is about getting diplomatically recognized, these guys have done a pretty good job of maintaining that. And just as far as crazy quirks go, they actually had an air force. So they didn't have a state, but they had an air force. And so from the 1947 to the early 1950s, and it's because as part of the treaties allowing Italy to be reconstructed after its defeat in World War II, they weren't allowed to have certain kinds of military airplanes, and so they painted the Maltese symbol on all of the airplanes, transferred the possession to them, or transferred title to them all to the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, which then operated its own air force until the treaty could be amended and the Italians got them back. So anyway.
Prop planes.
Yeah, they're World War II planes. Okay, and we mentioned North Korea as possibly a new monarchy. So although North Korea is nominally communist, obviously lots of communist states have had very radical revisions to their understanding of communism from the 1920s onward to the very capitalist, or at least capital intensive and economically powerful places like China. North Korea doesn't have that going economically, but they do have this very strange thing going in terms of they've had their leader for 3 generations has come from the single dynasty, the Kim dynasty, and the constitution of the state requires that. So in that sense, because they have a constitutional dynasty, even though they aren't using a title like king, actually most of the places don't use the title king or emperor. Emperor of Japan has their own title in Japan, but we use an equivalent for English. In that sense, this sort of seems to be emerging that way, or at least it's functionally like a new monarchy in a way, maybe.
Who's the man on the back?
Yeah, who's that guy?
Who's like that?
Maybe that was his uncle before he got I don't know, before he got put away as a threat. I don't remember. I don't know. I just picked this one because it seemed very kingly to have all of his people all lined up as he's doing this on the balcony. It's sort of kind of very.
I can see the weird haircut.
He does have an interesting style. So anyway, not a positive example of monarchy. There's negative. If we're talking about King John here, there's negative monarchs and positive ones. Anyway, so there's a long history, but the remnants are a bit quirky, right? So that's kind of as where we're at with monarchy. So in that sense, the fact that we got a new prince here in Canada, the seventh in line to the throne, Prince Harry announced just a couple days ago here that Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, gave birth to a son who's seventh in line. Unnamed as of yet, but the British odds makers think that Arthur is the most likely pick. I was actually thinking that before I even looked it up. I thought they should pick Arthur. We'll see. So it's time for another Prince Arthur. It's been a while. Among the royal names, however, one of the most unlikely is John. So very unlikely that they're going to pick John. And actually, John and Arthur are appropriate names to our story today. So King John. King John, I think, is most remembered at this point as Robin Hood's foe. And so, in fact, we think of him as Prince John in the Robin Hood story. And so Robin Hood himself is a legendary figure as opposed to a historical figure. The story is composed a couple centuries after, or starts to be written down for the first time a couple centuries after when King John would be around. And in some of the earliest forms that we have, the Robin Hood story, the king is kind of generically named Edward, which is a main name of kings in Edward the first, second, and third, succession, and John's grandson, and so forth. And so, in other words, set in a later time period. However, it got transferred to its present context now. So in the 16th century, retellings of the Robin Hood saga acquired kind of the present popular setting, which is to say, during that time period when Richard the Lionhearted, Richard the First, is king, but he's away at Crusade, and so John is still his younger brother. He's referred to as Prince John, although at this point, younger brothers and sons and members of the British royal family would not have the title prince yet. And so prince is actually a very weird title to give to people who aren't rulers. So the word prince means monarch or a ruler originally. And so it's like, for example, when you have Machiavelli, it's the prince. It's not writing about, Charles, Prince of Wales. The idea of it is the person who is a sovereign or the monarch of any given state. But the reason why in English we have this evolution of the word prince to mean a younger son or younger brother or a son of the monarch is because of this appanage, the traditional giving of the heir to the English throne, the title Prince of Wales. And so before the Prince of Wales, when there was Welsh, was the person who was the head of the Welsh people, the prince of their monarchy. When Wales was fully conquered and incorporated into England by Edward I, he abolished the local princes and named his son, Edward II, as the very first Norman or Angevin English Prince of Wales, and ever thereafter, then the male heir to the English throne has had that title, and that's why we say prince for those guys. Anyway, so the modern legend, then, the way we have it right now, and so this is the story you probably know and like about how Prince John and Robin Hood is shaped especially by Walter Scott's Ivanhoe in the early 19th century. And I also know the story primarily from being a kid and watching this as the Disney version, right? With all the animals. So, portrayed now, John, he's generally thought of as this kind of greedy guy who is very much introducing all these new taxes. He's very vain, and he's susceptible to flattery by all of his courtiers. He is a devious plotter, a liar, and an oathbreaker. By the way, so far this is actually, the case can be made for all of these things for the actual historical figure. But this is also true for good and bad kings from this time period. I'm going to argue that actually in order to govern effectively, you almost always have to break your oaths as a king in the Middle Ages, because if you otherwise you can't. You have to have some flexibility of movement. At some points or others, you have to make an oath, and then sometimes you have to also break it. But the problem is, of course, people don't like it, and if they don't like it, you do it too much.
Those Canadian prime ministers never do that.
So yeah, the comment is that our prime ministers here in Canada never break their oaths. But again, sometimes politicians have to promise a lot to get elected, and then the reality sets in when they look at the fisc. Likewise, again here with monarchs, sometimes in order to pay for government, you have to actually impose taxes, which John certainly did, and so exacted all this money. And then finally, the other one, whenever a king is doing anything that you don't like, everybody, what you always have to say is that he's been susceptible by these evil courtiers that are all around him. So it's really always Sir Hiss's fault, right? And so that was certainly true that the United States even made that, let's say, mummery or whatever with Japan, with Hirohito. Hirohito did not have to stand trial for war crimes or anything like that because he would simply been under the influence of bad courtiers who all had to be tried for war crimes. So likewise, this is what you do for good or bad kings when you're looking at them in the Middle Ages. When locals were doing it, contemporaries in the Middle Ages were looking. He's portrayed as being very reliant on his mother. And of course, King John actually had a very important and powerful mother, which is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is not brought up in the cartoon, but anyway, that's a true thing. And then always suffering by comparison to his brother Richard. And that has certainly been true of his historical reputation, being in the wake of a king who at least has had a reputation for being a very gallant knight and the figure of chivalry. So when you're living around in the shadow of Richard the Lionheart, who everybody wants to play, so everybody from Anthony Hopkins to Sean Connery to Patrick Stewart to the list goes on and on for Richard the Lionheart, it's not as easy to be the younger brother to that guy. You know when Patrick Stewart was playing him? Do you know which one that one is? Robin Hood Men in Tights, yeah. So essentially he's making fun of the fact that Sean Connery got like $1 million to just show up at the end of the the Kevin Costner Robin Hood movie, so that anyway. So Anthony Hopkins plays Richard in The Lion in Winter, which is a wonderful movie we've talked about before. So speaking of The Lion in Winter, so The Lion in Winter being about John and Richard's family and parents especially, who are two of the most famous, one of the most famous couples of this time period in the Middle Ages, Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry being one of the more, even though he's not as well remembered, one of the most influential kings of England, and one of the people who arguably set England on its path to having common law and all sorts of government as he set affairs in order after a civil war that he inherited. Trial by jury and things like that. So all of these things are in some sense going back to this kind of time period, and so this time period that John's around as well. And of course, Eleanor is one of the main women personalities of the Middle Ages, who is married to two different kings, the King of France, and later she annuls him and marries then the King of England. And she is then also kind of the power behind the throne for two more kings, her two sons, Richard and John. For Shaheen.
While she was married to the French king, didn't she ride with him on the Crusades?
Yes.
And the legend goes she did it bare-breasted.
That's the legend. So she certainly went on crusade with her maids, and caused a bunch of scandals. She hated Louis, so she found him to be, really, I don't know, pious and boring, and not not as kind of a active kind of king that she would like. And so she was from this southern French culture, so she's the heiress of 10 generations of the Dukes of Aquitaine, who were almost, kings in their own right, kings of the southern France, and whose background was, for example, the invention of all of the troubadour poetry. So all of that came through her grandfather's father's court, her own court, the court of Richard, her son, the Lionhearted, and so all of that ended up being like it was a very sophisticated cultural court compared to what she then had to go find when they went to Paris, which was not at the center of French cultural life back then, although it became so.
What, didn't they have 4 sons? My recollection is that John was number 4.
We'll get to the number of sons. Okay. We might get to it next slide. No, not yet. Next slide. One more slide and we'll get to that. So I just wanted to have this. So as we have Henry and Eleanor, that also usually comes with this map. This map is called by modern historians often the Angevin Empire, although there was no emperor involved and it wasn't ever viewed this way by any contemporaries. So, but the idea of it here, as we're looking at France, England, and so on Ireland and everything, is that the French king was technically king of all of France, but had very little power outside of, frankly, the Orange area. And so had a lot of claim to all the power outside as the feudal lord, but in a lot of cases, the main power, the main real power, was essentially going to the border and having the duke do fealty and essentially a nominal ceremony to say, yes, you are my king. But otherwise, having, for example, especially in the case of the Norman dukes, almost no other powers or rights over the Norman dukes. And so, by contrast then, Henry, whose paternal Angevin inheritance was Anjou and Maine, and so this area, and then his mother, the Empress Matilda, through that he inherited Normandy and England. And so, then obviously Eleanor, then Aquitaine. And then they claimed everything else, so anyway. So, therefore, because of that, this kind of thing that happened. So when Eleanor is married to Louis, then technically he had kind of, claim to control over all this, and he seemed like they were doing quite well, and he tried to go down there and march there and try to organize that into the French state, but it was hard for the area around Paris to incorporate much. So this is an area of a lot of rebellious vassals, and he doesn't have as much wealth to do it. And anyway, he doesn't get along with Eleanor. When she annuls him, she runs off. She immediately marries a count 10 years her junior, and within a couple of years he's king of England. Then suddenly the king of France is facing this, right? And so that's when all existential panic breaks out in the French monarchy. So the Capetians, the House of Capet, their policy becomes dividing Angevins and dividing up, all of this kind of power into smaller groups if they can, in order to break it all down to size, and if possible, destroy them. That they're not necessarily aiming that high at first. So, the Capetians, even though they're poorer, they have a couple strong suits. So the House of Capet, they didn't have much in the way of land, mostly that area around Paris. Nevertheless, they were quite successful at controlling or exploiting their domain, so they had done this thing where they appointed lots of local officials, bailiffs, who would go around and collect all the dues and everything like that. So they had a much stronger control over the local area than other people did. So the Dukes of Aquitaine ruled this huge, vast area, but they had very little control over any of it. And so they had that, and two, they were really good at producing one boy every generation. And so because they were land poor, having more the boys is actually a big problem, because you would have to give some of your little bit of land that you have to him. But if you produce only one and he dies, that's also a major problem. And so they were quite lucky, or providential, if you're thinking of it that way, to do it. And one of the ways that they also established a very strong chain of succession, is that each one of the kings would then associate the boy in the kingship. So in this case, Louis VII, who had been married to Eleanor when he has a new wife, who bears him sons, or a son, one son, when that kid is finally born, and he's essentially, everybody in France says this is the God-given boy because they didn't think that they were going to get one, just like that little Japanese kid, and so they finally get him, and they call him Philip Augustus, so Philip II. So he, as a child then, while his father's still alive, is crowned king of France. And so France has two kings, the senior and the younger. So they also then are benefiting in the course of these centuries by developments in feudal law and indeed just general legal political philosophy, which is making the monarchy more important. So before this, a couple of centuries before this, it doesn't matter so much if you're a count or a duke or whatever, a king, you have the title. The Capetians aren't that much bigger deal than, in some cases less so than the dukes that are technically their vassals. But as the universities are founded, as political theory advances, now suddenly feudal overlordship becomes much more important and the monarchy has a lot stronger claims. And so that just plays very strongly in the Capetians' favor. So the children we talked about. So Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine have, however many this is, 8 children. So William, the oldest boy, Henry, Richard, Matilda, Geoffrey, Eleanor, Joan, and John. John being the youngest. So the youngest of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boys, and of 8 kids. William dies young, so he doesn't make it all the way to adulthood. So then, with the other older boys, in part because, again, the Capetians were always going for this, Henry II agreed to divide his realms among his sons. And so the oldest surviving boy, Henry, who gets called the young king here, is to inherit eventually the paternal inheritance, so Henry's inheritance, Anjou, Maine, Normandy, in England. Whereas then Richard, the next oldest boy, is to get Eleanor's inheritance, right? So he'll become Duke of Aquitaine and continue on that Aquitanian ducal line. Geoffrey, they are able to marry off to the heiress of the Duchy of Brittany. And so they kind of had exercised a claim over Brittany that they were never able to put into effect. But when the heiress is all that's left, Geoffrey gets married, and so now suddenly they are able to control Brittany that way. And this left John without anything. So John's just a little kid at this point. And so his dad at some point jokes, "Oh, you're John Lackland." And so the other ones have names like Aquitaine and Brittany and everything. But anyway, John is Laxland. Okay, so following then, like I mentioned, that Capetian strategy of assuring the succession by crowning your son in your own lifetime, Henry has a son, Henry, crowned. And then that's why this younger Henry here is known as Henry the Young King, since he's king while his dad is king. So although the young king was to receive ultimately the lion's share of the inheritance, so England and Normandy, Anjou and Maine, he had to wait for his father's death in order to actually have that freedom or have that inheritance. When are you going to die, Dad? Because I'm supposed to get all of this. So meanwhile, Richard is off ruling Aquitaine more or less as a prince in his own right. He has all the income of this vast, wealthy duchy. He's able to fight all the wars he wants. He's able to sponsor poetry or anything that Richard wants to do. Geoffrey similarly is off as his own ruler, essentially left to his own devices, anything he wants to do in Brittany. The young king, meanwhile, only gets a little allowance from his father and is not able to make any decisions within these lands because he's more or less the apprentice king to Henry. So that ultimately, yes.
Is that the Richard that starts going eastward on what are called crusades?
Yes. So the question was, is this Richard who becomes Duke of Aquitaine, this second surviving son of Henry, is that Richard the Lionhearted, the famous crusader? And the answer is yes. But he doesn't go on the crusade yet, so he's still a young man at this point. So he goes on the crusade when he's a king. So later. So he's not a king. So his older brother is a king, and his dad's king, right? So one of the dangers, always. So the advantage is, it assures the succession. If we, like we say, the king is dead, long live the king. If you have a situation like the Capetians did, where when the king dies, you already have a king because he's already been crowned for like the past 10, 15 years, whatever it has been, right? And so everybody knows who the king is because just one king has died and there's already another king, right? But England had had all of these civil wars. For example, when William the Conqueror died, his oldest son Robert thought he was going to be king, but his second son William Rufus actually becomes king. When William Rufus dies, Robert, again, his older brother, wants to become king, but the youngest son, Henry I, is able to become crowned. When Henry dies, he wants his daughter to be crowned, Matilda, but instead her cousin, Stephen, who is a younger brother of the Count of Blois, so it's kind of a crazy thing that this guy ever got in there. He runs to London, gets crowned. And so in other words, anybody who gets the crown on their heads is a danger if you don't have anybody who already has the crown on their head, right? And so assuring the succession is really important, and so doing this in your own lifetime. That said, once you put the crown on your kid's head, and if he gets really mad at you, he might start thinking, hey, it'd be kind of neat if Dad was dead. I'm king, and I would be king all by myself. I would be able to be king just fine. And of course, because the French, their entire policy is to constantly sow rebellion among this family and everybody the French are always goading the young king to do that and to give him all kinds of support as soon as he rebels. So he rebels against his father, the young king, and the young king is joined by Richard, Geoffrey, and their mother, Eleanor, all sides with him. And so it's a major revolt in 1173. But Henry II is a very, just an amazing general and a really good counter-puncher always. And so at first it seemed like he was in lots and lots of danger. Everybody's betting on the young horse because, what are you going to do? This guy's eventually going to be king. So at a certain point, making the young king mad at you is actually really tough for any baron who sides with the dad, right? Because the guy will eventually win through the old guy dying someday. But in any event, the young king was actually quite a bad general. They ran off and did a bunch of things that were precipitous, and Henry just was able to separate out the enemies and was able to hold strongholds and ultimately was able to force everybody's surrender. And he more or less forgives all his sons, but he doesn't forgive his wife, who he then imprisons for the rest of his life. So Eleanor pretty much loses that rebellion, and thereafter she is in prison. So after that, then, the young king goes back to his dissolute ways. He's still upset living on an allowance. He goes in and has another rebellion. While he's having that rebellion, which nobody really joins, he contracts dysentery and dies. So now that's the end of William the oldest and Henry the young king. Then Geoffrey dies in 1186, so it's a fairly young man, again, before his father dies. He left a son, Arthur, and so that's had become already a name that potentially is a British royal name, although nobody has successfully gotten one of these Prince Arthurs onto the throne. There's been several, even of Prince Arthurs who were princes of Wales who didn't quite make it, died before their fathers. So anyway, so Arthur is actually, from these oldest three boys, the only male heir that is born. So we haven't achieved primogeniture yet, but if you were following primogeniture the way the English monarchy has it now, the heir is Arthur, right? So, change of plans. So we had done all this division before. Arthur is still obviously in Brittany, but now that the young king has died and Geoffrey's died, Henry II decides Richard should give up Aquitaine and he should become the young king. So now Richard is going to have to be, going to be able to inherit the kingdom of England, Normandy, and Anjou and Maine, but Richard has already seen what his brother's been going through, or what his brother was going through for all those years. The last thing he wants to do is give up Aquitaine, which he's been ruling all this time, and he has all these vassals, and he has this court, and he's established himself there, and he's going to give it up and give it to John for, and then in order to become the apprentice king to his dad, who he hates. And so Richard just absolutely refuses. So he won't give it up. So meanwhile, okay, so Richard's not giving up Aquitaine, and so he's on the outs with Henry, so Henry's not giving him the kingdom, but in the meantime, he's got to find something for John, so he's like, well, maybe we'll give John Ireland. That seems like a great thing, right? So John is sent to the island with knights and a court, but he quickly alienates all of the local Irish, and he also alienates all of the Norman invader knights and everybody too. So he is a bad kind of omen for his later being a king. so his first stint at trying to be a king in Ireland goes very, very poorly. And meanwhile, Henry had written to the Pope and said, I'd like a crown for my son. He's going to be king of Ireland. And the Pope writes back, he's like, what you talking about? And so the Pope says no to that plan. And so that never materializes. And so John goes back, leaves Ireland. Okay, so eventually Henry II does die of an illness in 1189 during one more rebellion. So he's fighting against Richard. Richard, of course, is supported by Philip, the King of France. It's always, but even then at the very end, as Henry's on his sickbed, his deathbed, he gets news that this time, this rebellion, even John turned on him. So his favorite son, who he hadn't been able to do that much for, also turns on him, and so he dies alone, right? So Richard is able to succeed to the entire inheritance. He didn't have to give up Aquitaine. John himself is left only with Ireland, which nobody's really controlling or getting anything out of. And later, after he proves his loyalty enough to Richard, he's allowed to marry his cousin, the heiress of the earldom of Gloucester. And so he has a bunch of rich lands in England, but he doesn't have any kind of secure base from which to even have a rebellion there. So Richard now, even though he has this entire time been allies with Philip against his dad, now he's the dad, and so now he's mortal enemies with Philip, and his whole rest of his career is spent fighting Philip Augustus, King of France. Okay, so just to kind of continue the story to get to where John's going to be king. So Richard then becomes, even though he's remembered very fondly as a great king, or he's well known anyway, he is actually quite an absentee king, and it goes off on crusade. So he's generally, I think, regarded as a very brave knight and a good general. He does a good job in most of his campaigns, but he's largely an absentee king as far as England is concerned. He maybe spent 6 months of his whole reign on the island. He was away on crusade from the years 1190 to 1194. So this is the third crusade. So the Jerusalem fell to Saladin. And so then the main kings of Europe for the second time, went, as opposed to the first crusade, which is all just regular nobles and things like that. Now it's a international enterprise where the King of England, the King of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor all take the cross to go to try to retake Jerusalem from Saladin. But the Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, drowns at a little river in Turkey, and so he was the greatest, essentially, army that was going out there. Anyway, that's the end of the whole German contingent, more or less. The French are extremely poor, but anyway, Philip goes there more or less to try to thwart Richard, all the time, and he goes home just as fast as he can, and once he gets home, he tries to conquer all of Richard's lands while Richard's still away. Richard spends years trying to make any kind of headway against Saladin, but they're just too outnumbered for it. So they are known, anyway, back and forth to each other as, chivalric monarchs who respect each other. But Richard, although he's able to restore the Kingdom of Jerusalem as a coastal enclave, so another century, the Crusader states last owning the coast, he's not able to get to Jerusalem despite how close he gets. And then while he's on his way back, he had insulted the remaining Germans in the German crusade because they didn't have a king representing them. He made their leader of their crusade, the contingent that made it down there, lower in status. And so when Richard is shipwrecked on his way home, he's caught by that guy, the Duke of the Austrian Duke of Austria, who then gives him to the new emperor and keeps him hostage. And so even though he's a crusader, the German emperor keeps him as a hostage for the just an outrageous sum of 150,000 marks of silver, which is to say something calculated between 2 and 3 times the annual income of the Kingdom of England. So it's a huge amount of money. You can imagine, if you think about this now, in the setting of the story of Prince John back in Nottingham, exacting all of these taxes from everybody. In the first case, the kingdom is trying to pay for this amazingly expensive crusade, and next it's trying to pay for Richard's ransom as he got captured while he's away on crusade. So at the very minimum, the government that's happening back there is actually Richard's fault, even though he's showing up as the hero at the end when they finally pay off the ransom, right? So anyway, to fast forward then to when Richard's dead. So Richard died from an arrow. He's again a great fighter and knight, and he is attacking a castle that the King of France had taken while he was away on crusade. And so while that's happening, he receives an arrow wound that becomes gangrenous, and he dies from it. Richard left no legitimate children, or maybe I don't think any children. And so therefore, all of John's brothers, of all of them that he'd had, when you're born and you're the 5th out of 5 sons, you don't normally think, boy, I'm sure going to be king. And in fact, when he was born, they stuck him in an abbey because they thought maybe that they were going to have him be like an Archbishop of Canterbury or something like that, which is maybe why John's a little better educated than his brothers. But in any event, now having had them all die, they all died without any issue except a male issue, except Geoffrey, who has this 13-year-old kid off in Brittany, Arthur, so a minor, who by the rules of primogeniture would be qualified to be king, but they haven't had anything like that in England for the last several generations. It hasn't been that way. So Queen Eleanor, who's still alive, she's been out of jail ever since Richard was king. She was running the continental domains while Richard was away on crusade. She rallies the entire realm behind John's succession, and so he is crowned King of England in May 1199. So, nevertheless, because there's a rival claimant, Arthur, the French policy, of course, is now we hate John, now we like Arthur, and so that immediately pivots, everybody's ready. So Philip immediately recognizes Arthur's claim, and then Arthur tries to, from his base in Brittany, tries to seize control of Maine and Anjou and Poitou, and so his troops are kind of down here. This is Brittany, this is Normandy, this is the border with the French king, and so he's down here on the Loire Valley. And John moves very rapidly, has a battle, defeats the rebels, and captures all the rebel leaders and also Arthur. So he starts off doing very good, and it looks like he's going to be another Henry or a Richard in terms of this kind of thing. However, he then starts to lose essentially the PR battle. Because again, one of the whole components of medieval monarchy is the king has to have the consent of the nobles, who are essentially the army, and otherwise, if you do this thing like on Game of Thrones, where Cersei just gets rid of every single person around her, you can't be king without other people. You have to maintain you can't make the small council get so small that there's nobody to give orders to. So essentially, John alienates the barons by allowing all of his prisoners to just suffer in their captivity, and actually a bunch of them die. And so then, so as a result of that, there's a negative fallout. Meanwhile, Philip is very smartly exercises his own feudal rights. And so John, in the meanwhile, has renounced his wife, his cousin, the Earl Countess of Gloucester, and has instead married a very wealthy heiress in the Aquitaine, who he may have been totally in love with. It's hard to say. At least he seems to have. There's not a lot of reason why it occurred. So his first wife, he is very known. We're talking about the vices. He's very known for all the mistresses and all the illegitimate children he has. Once he leaves her and has her annulled, and steals Isabella of Angoulême, he's not known to have any more mistresses. So and they have 5 kids together. So maybe he really liked her. Whatever the reason, the problem with it is she was already engaged to somebody else. That guy, who is a major lord of the Aquitaine, sues John in the court of France by saying, my immediate liege lord, the Duke of Aquitaine, has wronged me, and I want recourse as you are my king. So Philip then summons John to answer as Count of Poitou, as Duke of Aquitaine. John responds that because he's Duke of Normandy, the Duke of Normandy does not ever have to go to the court of France. They can only meet on the border right here. That's where they always go. That's where the two meet. And Philip responds that he is not summoning the Duke of Aquitaine. He is summoning the Duke of Normandy is summoning the Duke of Aquitaine. So you have to come. And so then when he fails to come, Philip convenes the whole court of all the barons, declares John to be an oathbreaker, that his fealty is terminated, and he terminates all of his right to any of the land. And so the court of France rules then that all of John's lands in France are forfeit. And so then Philip follows that off with his own invasion, and after all the times that the kings of France have been doing this for 200 years, he actually wins. And so he conquers these castles, they all fall, and John doesn't have the support of these local barons. He's not there in the rough time, and so essentially the French very successfully take over Normandy and later Anjou and Maine. As that is all falling apart, John, quick to make wrong moves always, is concerned that his prisoner Arthur is going to get away and be put as a rival in the area, and so presumably has him killed. So he disappears now from the record, and everybody locally at the time, contemporaries, assume that he killed him. We don't have the evidence for it, so we don't have habeas corpus, we don't have his corpse, but everybody, he was in John's captivity, then he's gone. So that's, anyway, and everybody blamed him for it. So Arthur's dead and gone. So as a result of that then, Philip successfully overruns Normandy, should have a D there, Maine, Anjou, but John retains control of Poitou and Aquitaine because Eleanor was down there rallying it, and so all of her vassals stay. So because she is still popular, even though John has lost and discredited himself everywhere else, England's able to hold onto those southern lands. So John doesn't consider this to be over, and generally speaking, in the Middle Ages, this wouldn't immediately be game over. So things go back and forth a lot. There are rebels, the rebels take over, and things can shift, and you can be restored to lands with, what seems like crazy fast rapidity. But all of John's plans, in terms of making further alliances, for example, with the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto IV, don't work out because ultimately when it all comes to a big battle, one of the few battles that you actually have of this kind of scale in the Middle Ages, at Bouvines, the emperor is defeated by Philip and the French forces in the field. John isn't able to make it to the battle. So essentially, John is defeated without him even necessarily being there, and so the loss is permanent. So, what had happened then, I know this is a whole lot of backstory, so now we got to see that's a lot to know about John and all of the background in terms of all this, so thanks for sticking with me with all this. So what has happened in this kind of time period, think of now knights, these aren't with the plate mail, but with all of the chain mail and all this kind of thing, warfare has become increasingly professionalized. It's becoming extremely expensive. The horses are amazingly expensive. The weapons, the armor, the castles that are now being made out of stone are expensive. Siege equipment, ships, navies, provisions for all of these. It just costs far beyond at this point what the normal operations of any kingdom's fisc are like. So in terms of the regular revenues that traditionally medieval kingdoms are holding, they just simply can't afford to have wars with what the wars now cost out of regular revenues. So, having lost everything on the continent, having lost the last battle, having planned and spent all the expenses of having all of these wars but not being able to fulfill them, John has one more indignity when he gets back to England or when he retreats back to England. So if you have been victorious in battle like Philip, so Philip had to tax everybody up and down the wazoo too in order to get to Bouvines and win. But when you're victorious, then you can easily be forgiven, right? So when you're continually defeated, however, when the nobles are constantly losing too, they quickly resent then the royal exactions that they might have shouldered had they had a victory. So all of these ongoing exactions dating back to Richard to pay for unending wars on the continent led the nobility to rebel against John in 1215. So he's faced with a domestic rebellion where essentially he loses control of England and is surrounded and has to negotiate with the rebel barons. And so having lost then the trust of all these barons who look at him as an oathbreaker in terms of Arthur, kills his nephew here. There's a lot of concern that he's not following through on anything. He is also, in order to raise revenues, he has twisted things in order to, and a lot of nobles have lost all of their property and things like that. So there's a lot of concern. So in order to, because they don't trust him, they force him to accede to their demands that he swear to abide by this set of articles, which are designed to limit all of the exploitation that he's been doing of all these traditional feudal and royal prerogatives. So John has been doing everything that he can to raise funds in order to get an army to Bhutan and all this kind of thing. And in order to do that, he's been pressing tradition beyond to the point where it's broken. So the document, and it's not initially called Magna Carta, but the document that he puts a seal to is in fact just meant to buy peace. So John has no intention of following it, frankly. The barons really don't have any belief that John will follow it, and they are proved right in that. But essentially they're at the beginning of a rebellion and a war, and this is essentially a document that they made in order to say, can we negotiate peace here and things like that? And the answer actually is that it's, as a document in its initial stated purpose, it fails. Because they immediately accuse each other, both sides, of bad faith, and warfare breaks out to total warfare for the next 2 years. Anyway, so we'll look at what it essentially resolves itself because John dies. So I mean, and then essentially then at a certain point the barons then say, well, there's his young son Henry here. We maybe we can work with him, and Henry's government reissues the charter too then, and we'll get to that. But essentially for a medieval king, so like for Richard or for John or for Philip Augustus, essentially you have three major categories in terms of sources of revenue, which are the exploitation of the royal domain, so your own individual private lands or the lands of the crown that you have inherited, all of the traditional royal or feudal prerogatives, so all the different things that kings have by right, and those are very broad ranging, so the right to essentially levy fines in terms of your own court cases when there's justice, the right to call on your knights that are in fealty to you to go to battle with you, or if they don't want to go to the battle, to pay you a tax in order to get out of it. The inheritance tax in order to inherit a fief, a widow if she wants to not be married off to the person that you want to marry her to, she can pay you a tax. So when you are having your son knighted and you want to have a big party, everybody in the realm has to pay you in order to have your son knighted. In other words, all of these kind of traditional obligations and rights and things like that you inherit through custom and tradition. And so these are customary rights. And there's ways to make money. And then finally, direct taxation. So that's just as popular back then as it is now, but in a lot of cases is rarer. So although the kings were ideally expected to live off domain revenues, this is essentially impossible. So more or less it's fixed. So once you do like what the King of France does, which is to say have the bailiffs and you're exploiting it to just about as much money as the agricultural produce can make, there's just nothing more you can do. And in fact, in order to pay for a lot of the things like the Crusade, Richard had actually alienated a lot of the domain lands. And so kings, ideally, they themselves wanted to live out of that income because it's fixed and they get a hold of it. And people looked at them and they said, you have all this land, you should be able to do it. But the amounts are nothing compared to what you need, especially if you're having a war. So it's just absolutely impossible to do it. You have a question, Jane?
Well, what I was going to ask, what monies were the
Domain lands,
domains,
yeah. So, yeah.
able to produce for the king.
So essentially it's income. So the major part of the economy in all of these medieval states is agriculture. So everybody in the society almost is a peasant, and they're almost all engaged in farming. And so there is a small amount of surplus that all is being made. All of that surplus, the peasants are all serfs, so they're not free. The landowners are either the barons or the dukes or the king. And so when the king, just like any other landlord, just like the bishop of Winchester owns a lot of land, and so he gets all the revenue from the excess crops that are grown on his land. And same thing, the king owns a lot of land, both his own personal family land and then also crown lands that he's inherited because he's king. And so in those cases, if there's all the revenues that are made by selling the extra grain go to the king.
Through the merchant class, or how does?
So the question is, through the merchant class, how would it work? So there is a merchant class, and so that is especially, in England's case, that's especially noteworthy in terms of the wool production, right? So one of the things that you're also doing on your land is you have a bunch of sheep, and you shear the sheep, and through that merchant class, the wool is all exported to Flanders, where it's manufactured into wool garments. And so England's economy is very tied up with Flanders at this time for that region. And so in that sense, it's done that way. But essentially those domain lands, all of these taxes and other kinds of revenue are collected in silver pennies, and then that goes to the, like you say, it goes to the king.
But it's very minimal.
It's minimal to what a war costs. So you just can't offer that. I mean, all the nobles have land, but it's not like you suddenly, like if you have a regular fixed income, of, let's say, whatever, $20,000 a year that you're getting off of your basic income, and then you go and buy a $250,000 war, you just can't, you're never going to get it back. You're never going to be out of that debt hole. And so you have to have these other things, right? And so direct taxation, generally speaking, everybody saw it when you levied a tax across the whole state and that kind of thing. There was some capacity for doing it, so there's like the Saladin tithe. So they exact a tithe upon everybody because Saladin has conquered Jerusalem, and so everybody's got to pay a percentage of all of their income in order to, as a direct taxation. People hate it. They resist it like crazy. If you try to do it a bunch of times, it really makes public opinion go down. So you're going to have the rebellions, like the nobles here rebelling, and they also resist it. So you don't actually collect much at a certain point unless you have a buy-in to do a tax like that. And so John doesn't get to do very much of that. And so what he's primarily focused on is maximizing all of the money that he can get out of all of these traditional feudal obligations, right? And so all of the kind of things and feudal prerogatives. But that ends up resulting in all kinds of bad governance, right? Because instead of trying to do all the things, let's say, that the government does, like do justice or having efficient courts or things like that, or issue charters when the charter is meaningful or useful, John now sells the charters to whoever can pay for them. Or you might sell the title, or you might sell the widow's inheritance rights or any other thing. And so as a result of that, he gets the cash, but then it ends up being tyrannically enforced, and so it becomes very, very unpopular. So that's why, for example, when we get then to this Barons' Charter, what the Barons' articles that they demand John sign, although it's remembered as foundational to constitutional liberties, the document really is concerned with preventing royal abuse of the nobility. So the nobles haven't had enough of this. They're trying to, and John, if they think that they can get John to do all these things, which they don't think they can, if he'll at least put his seal to it and say he will, then they feel like they may be able to make peace with him. So what are some of the things? We can read about it. They're listed in all of the Magna Carta, and I've gone on long enough that I don't actually have the slides that we're going to go through every little detail, but you can read it online, Magna Carta too, or in books. So it's include things like feudal relief. So that means essentially if you are an earl of something, you've died, and you want, the Earl of Grantham has died, and they want Lady Mary and her husband or Lady Mary's son to inherit, they have to pay the feudal relief in order to get that title to pass, in order to get through essentially like probate, right? So the king, that's in the king's hand for the inheritance for barons. Exploitation of wardships for minors. So if there's a minor who you might be able to appoint somebody to be the ward of that minor, and that guy might pay the king a lot of money to be the ward because he knows that he is going to be able to exploit that kid's lands until that kid grows up, and so he'll be able to make all the money back. And so exploitation of wardships, forcible remarrying of widows. So a widow is the heir, or we're controlling all this property. Again, her right of who she marries, and actually all noble marriages are in the king's power. And so forcibly remarrying her. Regulating scutage. So we mentioned how all the knights and nobles owe the king military service, but a lot of them don't want to do it. And so they instead have to pay a tax in lieu of what they owe. And so John maybe says that they owe way more of that in scutage than what they want to pay, and so regulating that. And then things like rolling back the royal forests. That seems like a crazy thing to us now. We think of Sherwood Forest as one of the reasons I mention it, but it's actually a major component of this charter because the kings of England had special rights over forests. And in fact, they could be almost like crazy tyrants within the forest where you had no right to almost anything. It's their game preserves, but they control all the lumber, they control everything in the forest, and there's very harsh forest courts. And one of the things that had happened under Richard and John is that the kings had expanded the forest. And so suddenly maybe your village is now in a forest, according to law, and that means that anything you might do, like go grab wood for your fire, is suddenly subject to forest law, or trying to hunt rabbits or something like that. So you would now be subject to extreme penalties. And so it's almost like the President of the United States can simply designate federal lands. That's now a national park. And that's popular for a lot of people who like national parks, but for people who live right next to that, or who maybe were renting that land very cheaply from the government for their cattle or something like that, they really get mad about that kind of thing. So anyway, it's like that, only worse with the royal forests. And so John rolls back all the royal forests. And so one of the reasons why that I mentioned that also, not only that Robin Hood being in the forest thing, with the story, but also because later everything that's in Magna Carta, the charters about the forest law, was not sufficient as far as they were concerned. So they later had to actually issue a second charter of the forests. And so those would always get reissued together. So all these extra forest law clauses, and that's why the bigger charter is called Magna Carta, because it's always reissued with the little charter of the forest. And so in fact, even though we think of Magna Carta as being this great charter, it's great because it's bigger than the little forest one. But anyway, that's how it gets its name. So that said, in addition to that, there is a bunch of stuff in there that does start to form, or it later gets remembered as the basis for rights and liberties that have come down to us this day. So the text also states that no one, or at least no free person, should be put on trial, for example, solely on the basis of the unsupported word of a royal official. So if the justicer comes along and says, you did that, well, without just that say-so, you can't be put on trial just for that. No free man could be imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions without due process being legally applied. That's one of the few provisions. There's only 3 provisions that are still legal still in legal force in the United Kingdom. This one, the freedom of the church and the freedom of the City of London, are the 3 statutes. The rest have all been, because it's an ongoing document, they've all been either repealed or superseded, the provisions of Magna Carta. So anyway, due process, that the barons should be tried by their peers. So ultimately that means everybody should be tried by their peers in the later building upon this. Things like the king should only appoint qualified persons to become justices. So that's something that apparently, because of its existence in common law, for example, a Supreme Court of the California a few years ago cited that as being essential to whether or not somebody's qualified to serve as a judge. And so it's just citing Magna Carta as one of those things. And finally, things like not selling justice. So you want a speedy trial? Well, pay for it. So that also is, then forbidden by this, what becomes Magna Carta here. And so I mentioned here there's that difference between how the United States is looking back on it and how the UK and the Commonwealth do. So because for the United States, Magna Carta and all of British common law was just sort of absorbed into it as kind of background prior to parliamentary supremacy. So the American colonies are all there before Parliament has achieved supremacy in the British system. So as a result, the U.S. Constitution, when it references at the end that all rights and liberties that have not been enumerated in this document that are essentially belonging to the people won't be infringed. It's referring all the way back to Magna Carta. So all of these things that are in Magna Carta are just assumed to be, in U.S. Let's say, general common law rights. Whereas what happened in the tradition for the UK and Commonwealth is because Parliament is supreme and is in charge of all laws and things like that. So it's an active document that Parliament has continuously revised, and that's why, like I say, 3 of the provisions are still in force and the rest have been superseded by Parliament. So anyway, 2 different ways that the thing has been built on. So this has been, and I appreciate all of you being with me for the whole thing, a winding road of historical memory from a Baron's Charter to what became Magna Carta. And from what I would say is actually kind of a mixed bag king. There's certainly no doubt that he lost the battles, and that's what's most important in a way, at least for contemporaries. To evil Prince John. Nevertheless, there are other important characteristics of medieval kingship, like, for example, producing a son, which Richard failed to do. And so John actually did that. And anyway, so as a result, he was, like I say, he did a bunch of things bad, but he gets blamed in a way for all the kinds of things that if he had won the battles, he may not have been blamed for. So a big, long, winding road to Democracy's Unlikely Origins with King John and Magna Carta. That went long. Sorry about that. Do you have questions or comments? Or, yeah, Elizabeth.
It's sort of, maybe it's peripheral, maybe it's not. But I think it's notable that at the time, England wasn't a big deal. France was the big deal.
Yes.
And England, if John or anybody else had to choose between being the Duke of Aquitaine and claiming a lot of other land in France and being King of England, he'd stay in France.
Yeah, and well, of course, like you say, Richard.
And he did stay in France.
Richard did, right?
Did, yeah.
So Richard only spent 6 months in England, right? And so in his whole kingship of England. But like you say, so maybe the population, I don't remember, but it's maybe England's population is maybe 1/10 that of France in the Middle Ages, as opposed to now when Britain and France have the same population, right? And so as a result of that, like you say, there was so much more wealth and population and everything else going on in France. The difference was that the English kings had much more control over English land, territories, and revenues. And the barons, already as of the Norman conquest, were not like little sovereigns like they were in France. And so as a result of that, the English kings, in their position as French barons, which is what they were when they were the Dukes of Normandy or the Counts of Anjou, were rich enough to play the game compared to, like, let's say, the Count of Flanders or the Duke of Aquitaine or the Duke of Burgundy or the Counts of Blois, Champagne, or something like that.
And also, of course, in those days, it was considered perfectly normal and good to go to war.
Yes.
And try to take over as much territory as you could. And as you say, as long as you won the battles, you would be forgiven all your sins.
Yes. Yeah, but in the end, it was already changing. So by the time when, so for example, I made that example of Henry V, who, after that whole 100 Years' War, or more or less kind of wins.
Yeah.
But in a way, if so then he dies, and so then his son is an incompetent king and they lose everything. Joan of Arc. We'll talk about the 100 Years' War in some future lecture. But let's say he hadn't had it all lost. So if in fact his son had been a really competent king and had been king of France and England, the reality was that, like you say, the center of gravity would have been Paris. And so even though it was England that had conquered France, within 2 generations, England would be a colony of France. And so it's actually, anyway, so what do you win by winning, So, yes.
I'm just curious, the legend of King Arthur, was that written, how long is that written, later in history or before history? And if it's later in history, is it like a tribute to the disappeared Arthur in some way, or is it totally different?
So it's a good question, it's a very good question. So it's actually it's a legend that's written just a few decades before Arthur's born. And so it's amazing. Geoffrey of Monmouth writes a book called The History of the Kings of Britain, which includes for the very first time the Arthur legend. And it's believed, he pretends that it's a real history, and it's widely believed to be a real history, and it's an international bestseller, and within 20 years, Arthur of Britain is viewed as being like one of the models of chivalry, because here was this ancient king who did everything like a 12th century chivalric knight. Why was he so chivalric? Because it was only written about right then. In other words, the idea of it was created right at that time, so he was exactly what the people at the time were looking for. And so because of this august, historic ancient king that was in Britain, Geoffrey names his kid Arthur for that reason. And so the British, the royal house has tried on numerous occasions to have a Prince Arthur and a King Arthur, but just like the Black Prince, for example. Oh no, he's Edward. Anyway, there's an Arthur. Henry VIII's older brother is Arthur, for example, yeah. Yeah, so there's more than one Arthur, but Arthur they haven't made it. Still, it's not likely anytime in the future, unless little George is going to have a boy that's named Arthur.
Yeah, wasn't there one in the 20th century, early 20th?
Could be, yeah. Arthur's on the list, but anyway.
So I have a
One second,
question.
he's first, and then.
I have a question. Why is it that it was in Britain that barons and nobility were able to impose those conditions on a king, which just happened to lose few battles or few wars? He was not the only king who lost wars. He was not the only king who was squeezing nobility and the whole population and was greedy. What was different about England at that time that allowed them to make this leap forward that we now see as the seed of sort of democratic tendencies?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I would have loved to have had, even if I hadn't gone this long. By the time I got to this point in the slides, I didn't put the all the leap in between. So it's a great question. The answer is they didn't oppose it. So in other words, even though they wrote out all the things that they wanted, and they got the king to put his seal on it, as soon as he got away from them, they continued to have their war, and for another 2 years. He immediately wrote, even though one of the clauses is that he won't ask for any third party to annul, the charter. He immediately, and of course that means the Pope, that he immediately writes the Pope, and he has the Pope annul it. So the Pope annuls what becomes Magna Carta, so this original charter, and condemns it, and ultimately John, as part of there's all of the different chess pieces, and so one of the chess pieces is separating off the bishops and the Pope from being on the side of the barons potentially. And so he's able to do that, one, because the church supports monarchy anyway, and so that certainly at that time period in the Middle Ages, but two, he makes another kind of deal where the popes, because of a document called the Donation of Constantine, felt that they had special control over islands, and England's an island. And so just like the Norman kings of Sicily had become vassals of the Pope, John surrenders his kingdom to the Pope and receives it back as a vassal. And as a newly, he's on the Pope's side, this Pope, who is the most powerful Pope of the Middle Ages, Innocent III, now, supports John to the end, excommunicates all his enemies and all this kind of thing. So he really is able to, even though it seems like it's a big giving up something, the Pope doesn't actually ever get anything out of being, the vassal overlord of England. But John got a temporary, victory against the barons. So in theory, Magna Carta should have been wiped out right then and never come back. So how does it survive? So John dies. His son Henry is a minority government. At a certain point, the rebellion is continuing. The regency of Henry decides to reissue a version of Magna Carta. They delete like a bunch of clauses, but anyway, they reissue it, and then they also ultimately issue like the Forest Law. And so ultimately, even though they continuously the kings continuously keep renouncing it for a century, when they're weak, they have a tradition of reissuing it, as a way to kind of buy with the barons. And so there's almost no ability to enforce it. But as the clauses of it include, you have to read it in all the churches everywhere 4 times a year. So people are starting to be familiar with the precepts as when it's been reissued, as, let's say, each individual thing as you're reading it, you think, oh, well, that's customary right, or this is what our customary rights are as Englishmen, right? And so over time, this thing that had no force of law, it continues to become traditional to reissue it, and then ultimately it becomes kind of a part of common law, and then it is still doesn't do that much. But it's when later the emergence of Parliament, they look back and they see Magna Carta and they kind of make more of a legend of it. And so British jurists in that time period, when we talk about like this prism of history, so 500 years ago, 400 years ago, British jurists expanded the consequences of Magna Carta in the historical imagination. And it's subsequently gone through revisions where people think much less of it and more and less. And the same thing is true for John. So John, it was kind of a forgotten king, not really important or not. But when the Reformation happened, because John had, all the way up until that point I told you about where he becomes a vassal of the Pope, he had been actually fighting the church and the Pope. So he's remembered by the Protestant historians as a guy who stood up to Rome and who was asserting the independence of England against the papacy. And so in the plays that influenced Shakespeare, so Shakespeare has the play King John, the plays influencing it before that, they're all, John's the hero. Because he's a Protestant, a proto-Protestant, who is essentially towing the line against Rome. But then by the time the Victorian era rolls around, they're more aware of the vices again, right? And so the Victorians don't like that he's drinking around, sleeping around, all these kind of things, oath breaking, killing his nephew, that kind of thing. And so then he gets worked into things like Ivanhoe as the kind of the villain. So each time, as there's this oscillation of the revision of it, John's in a different place, and same thing Magna Carta. So I don't think it necessarily is that unique. It's just where they were at that time. And so, there's been 3 hands up. Let's, Valerie was first, I think, and then Yvonne.
I was going to say, it sounds like the perfect postmodern text that's been fluidly interpreted and reinterpreted every which way.
Yeah, I like that. It is kind of interesting. So one of the things that happens, especially when our historical antiquarianism goes back far enough, right? And so a lot of things we don't have, aren't among the early things that the proto-historians were writing about 400 or 500 years ago. But when it is those things, then we have, revision as we become better at academic history than the original antiquarians were. But
could you mention what the 3 surviving clauses of Magna Carta that survive in British common law?
So my understanding is the first clause is guaranteeing the freedom of the church, and so that continues to exist. There is a clause that is guaranteeing the freedom of the City of London. So So there is although almost all of the clauses are about nobles and all of the things that nobles care about, there are a small number of clauses that are about this emerging merchant class, and so not harassing foreign merchants, all the different things, regulating the king's power over the Jews, which is to say the moneylenders and other moneylenders, those kind of things. There are clauses like that. Those are not continued to be in force. But anyway, but London, in other words, as the most important city, so its emerging commune, so that's continued. And then the other one here was, due process, so that you can't be imprisoned or stripped of your rights or possessions without due process. So in other words, you can't have this arbitrary rule where you just seize people and their stuff.
A second question, if possible.
Yeah.
Could you just recapitulate some of the events leading up to the Battle of Bhutan?
Yes.
Is that part of Arthur's rebellion? Is that a conclusion to it?
So it's a conclusion to the war that Philip and the kings of France have been having with the kings of England, or it's a conclusion of that phase, right? Because that means that now, finally, after all these centuries, the English kings have lost Normandy. So the kings of France have been trying to, frankly, conquer Normandy ever since that they gave it away to the Vikings in the first place, because it's very dangerous for them. The Vexin is like just upriver from Paris. The Normans are almost always able to, go from their position a quick march and sack Paris, which is a very dangerous thing for them. And so so Bouvines is what allows finally Philip Augustus, having won that battle, having essentially defeated all of John's allies, the Counts of Flanders, the Holy Roman Emperor, and all of his local allies, he defeats them all, and then he more or less relegates John to England and then just the south. So he's left with that foothold that becomes Gascony, which the English then have throughout the entire 100 Years' War. So that's like a new phase of the war between England and France. But this was the end phase of that period of time where previously the kings of France were always so poor in relationship to their Norman vassals. Now they're the kings. And so Philip is, in some sense, the real founder of the state of France. So Philip, having defeated John, having taken Normandy and put Normandy as part of the French royal domain, never to be alienated ever again, ever after, until the kings of France lost their head, they've never given that up again, And so they would give away Anjou and Maine to different sons as appanages, but they would never lose Normandy again. And so anyway, that's why that was so important. And so it's a transition entirely. It set France on the road that it's been on ever since too. Yep. Yes, Erjan.
It looks like the origin of democracy is not like Magna Carta, it's more like Athens and Rome. It's more
Yes.
like exaggeration of the English culture, I believe, isn't it? Or otherwise we have like Athens and Rome is the true origin of democracy.
Well, so there's no continuity, though, for Athens. Rome isn't really a democracy. I mean, Athens is... What?
It's a republic.
Republic. Well, anyway, so the question of it is, so what are we even calling it? I mean, so there is this kind of Anglo-American or Anglican, English and, whatever, Commonwealth tradition, of how did we get to this particular mixed constitution system, right? So in a way, when you're looking back at Bouvines, you couldn't forecast out, that, the Holy Roman Empire would get totally wiped out and Germany would become a republic, that the French kings were going to lose their heads, and that somehow the kings of the English were going to develop this very weird thing that still happens in a way, right? So they're the head of state to a country that has had parliamentary supremacy, since the Glorious Revolution, right? So and so it is in a way, even though the country hasn't been a republic, it's not a republic. It has had this situation where the actual supremacy is held by the parliament, right? So it is its own thing, and it has caused. It is the direct antecedent for lots of the world's republican democracies, like the United States, which had then additional influence. So the U.S. Revolution, what was going on in Britain, influenced what happened in France. But in terms of theory, certainly at the time, people were always doing revivals and looking back to Athens, or they were looking at, like you say, the precedent of the Roman Republic. So the framers of the U.S. Constitution, in addition to looking at Magna Carta, were also looking at what the Roman Constitution. And in fact, we're having a future lecture on the Roman Constitution of the Roman Republic. But anyway, so what is the exact thing? So a lot of times I like to look at the difference between, let's say, a direct antecedent and then a revival where there's no, where in other words, where people look back at something and they see ancient Athens. There's no continuity between the Athenian democracy and anything in the present, but people certainly read the classics and that influenced what they were doing. I mean, in the sense that people have argued now that, for example, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Six Nations that are this major power between the English colonies that became the United States and the French colonies that became Canada, because they had essentially a republic and an egalitarian republican form of government, that may have had more direct influence on the United States than contemporary monarchy that they're coming out of. So it isn't always clear, I think, what the direct antecedent of anything is. Yvonne and then Valerie.
Just a brief digression related to the 13th century. The Iroquois Confederacy, which is better known as the Haudenosaunee,
yes,
referring to people of the Longhouse, is formed around 1250 by Hiawatha and his father Denenda.
Yeah.
It just a coincidence?
Oh, that it's the same time frame. Yeah, and continues as a dependent sovereign nation here in Canada. Yes, Valerie.
Yes, John, the slide you had on just now about trial by jury, where every free man,
yes,
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, would this have been, would this right have been available immediately upon the signing of the Magna Carta, or did it arise a little later? And also, of what proportion of the population might have fallen under that designation? Now, I'm assuming serfs were not free men.
That's right, exactly.
And so, to whom would that have applied at the time? Like villeins and noblemen and that kind of thing? Or
5%.
5%.
So something like that. So it's essentially the little merchant class. It's like it's freeholders, so people who have any kind of land, even as a very small amount, but certainly not the entire serf population. In terms of it taking effect, it was immediately nullified. So it didn't take effect at all. So what happened was that as that becomes an idea, in other words, the iteration of Magna Carta itself is actually the nobles trying to write down what they understand customary law to be, with an idea of limiting excesses by the king. And so in a lot of cases, things like that were already practices. But the difference here with having a written into a charter is you're going from oral tradition and oral law, which is where you're getting together all of the nobles in the council and they remember how things are done. But it becomes flexible because as people remember, they adapt and this kind of thing. That gets replaced by written law. And when that happens, written law can often be inflexible compared to what went before. But on the other hand, when you have to do it, especially in the case of like someone like John, when you don't trust him, right? And so because they wanted to have it, this is what the laws are. But it doesn't take effect at all.
Yeah, so let's say the serfs, who I'm assuming would have formed the bulk of the population, under what sort of law were they judged? Would it have been like their immediate lord's discretion?
Yes. Yeah, so the serfs are essentially getting whatever justice they have from the manorial court. So each one of the knights has their own court, and so we think about it as like the royal court, right? When we think about it as the courtiers, all the different nobles hanging around having a party. But it's also it has the same word as court, because the nobles had the capacity to dispense justice in their own local jurisdictions. In a lot of cases, this is also something that ultimately becomes a later abuse that gets corrected. So transferring things from local manorial courts and eliminating manorial courts to the royal jurisdiction or the shire court. And so, but most of the population don't have that. It's the tiny percentage of people that are freemen who are able to, and women, because women can also, under certain circumstances, sue for the rights that they have as a dower right or certain property rights and things like that. But the free people that are able to bring cases to the shire and royal courts, or in the case of clergy, who are a big percentage of that free class, the clerical courts, so with benefit of clergy. Well, we should probably conclude because we've gone a long time, guys, and thank you guys all so much. And we can continue on.